Thank you very much, and good evening to both people in the room and people online, and people I know and people I don't. Always a pleasure to see new faces. After all that list of all the things I've done, I must emphasise that tonight I'm speaking personally, not on behalf of anyone, and as they say on social media, my opinions are my own. But I would like to thank some lottery staff, in particular Robin Eelmore, who helped me out with some data and sent me a large number of lists of data on very, very small spreadsheets, which I then worked out what they all meant. So an introduction to me, as David has said, I'm a member of the London and South Committee of the Heritage Fund. I'm also chair of the Wiltshire Museum in Devizes these days, and as David also has said, formerly CEO of BPT, a trustee and an elected council member of the National Trust in a term that came to an end this summer. And before that, I was a consultant working in the cultural sector, mostly on capital projects. And obviously in that guise also ran into the lottery. So I've sort of done everything with the lottery as far as I can think. Been an applicant, assessed applications, been what they call an expert advisor, bought a ticket, that's the important bit, because otherwise none of this would happen. Not won very much, unsurprising, given the odds. And so I feel that this talk, in putting it together, I've been going right back to far into the depths of my personal career. I've lived and worked through the last 30 or 40 years of cultural funding in this country. And so I've been able to spend a lot of time, thanks to this talk, rummaging through various boxes and shelves and what might laughably be called a personal archive, or what my family would say is boxes of junk. It's difficult to remember accurately what life was like 30 or 40 years ago. Contemporaneous material, as all good historians know, is a great help. And all those boxes I was thinking of throwing away have now reasserted their usefulness and importance, much to the despair of my family. As Maria Kondo may learn one day, for some of us, old files of fading paper are what can spark joy much more than an empty shelf. This slide, by the way, shows the original Heritage Lottery Fund logo in 1994. I even have with me, for old time's sake, an original application pack. Just because I will no doubt trip over it, and almost everyone who's had anything to do with the lottery has tripped over it, it was the Heritage Lottery Fund, aka HLF, until 2019, and then changed its name to the National Lottery Heritage Fund when all the lottery bodies unified their look and their logo and so on. Nobody can ever remember this. I'm trying to remember it this evening by referring to HLF when it was HLF and the Heritage Fund otherwise, but you will know that it's all the same thing. So what am I going to talk about? I want to talk really and use a reasonable chunk of time to talk about how the lottery came about and what the world was like before the lottery. Then background context to the lottery and to the Heritage Fund. Then the Heritage Fund in the UK as a whole, and then focusing down on Bath and North East Somerset and Bath in particular, which will be the bit with most of the pretty pictures. And then I wanted to conclude with a what if, or a couple of what ifs. What if there had never been lottery funding for heritage? And what if there were not in the future lottery fund for heritage? And then I hope you will all lift us out of the gloom that that might give us with some questions. So you'll have recognised the provenance of this talk's title, the famous Life of Brian sketch where Reg, leader of the People's Front of Judea, rhetorically asks the crowd what the Romans have done for them and gets all this sort of stuff shouted out from the audience. Now that gives a number of rabbit holes I'm not going to go down, amongst them Monty Python's view of colonial history. But suffice it to say that I think the list of what the fund has done for heritage in Bath and for the UK might carry a similarly comprehensive range of benefits. However, perhaps first of all we should just touch on that word heritage. The Oxford English Dictionary defines heritage as property that is or may be inherited, an inheritance, valued things such as historic buildings that have been passed down from previous generations, and relating to things of historic or cultural value that are worthy of preservation. It perhaps first gained currency in public policy discourse in 1980, when the National Heritage Memorial Fund was set up as a successor to the National Land Fund in the first of four National Heritage Acts. These consolidated and restructured various parts of the heritage sector that were then within government and turned them into either autonomous charities, Kew Garden was one in that first act, or quangos. In the second of these acts, the care of historic monuments was taken out of government, where it languished in a corner of the Department of the Environment, and given to a new quango called the Historic Building and Monuments Commission, which in turn went under the working name of English Heritage. And a similar development happened in Scotland. By the 1990s, heritage had been elevated to cabinet status, with a Department of National Heritage set up in 1992, and David Mellor MP in post as the self-styled Minister for Fun. We can go back into David Mellor if we really need to at a later point. The original application materials for the then Lottery Fund said that the fund aimed to, quote, improve the quality of life by safeguarding and enhancing the heritage of buildings, objects, and the environment, whether man-made or natural, which have been important in the formation of the character and identity of the United Kingdom, an emphasis, therefore, on tangible heritage. Nowadays, the Heritage Fund defines heritage as, quote, anything from the past that you value and want to pass on to future generations. You might argue that this sails perilously close to a Humpty Dumpty definition, where responsibility for ascribing value is given to, as it were, the people, not the expert. But it's not, in fact, that far from the OED definition, in that the implication is that heritage is, as one might put it, cultural value over time. So if the 1980s invented the heritage quangocracy, what state was our heritage in, and how is it funded? The 1980s were a very particular time. For the younger members of our audience, let me explain that Conservative Mrs. Thatcher was Prime Minister for the whole decade, with a large, and in the mid-1980s, landslide parliamentary majority. The early years of the decade were marked by austerity and the Falklands War. Her government's achievement of a later booming economy nevertheless failed to trickle down and created significant social polarization. The political philosophy was one of self-reliance and self-help, and unsurprisingly, this also found expression in attitudes to cultural funding. In any case, the time of large state handouts was long dead, as early as the early 70s. For example, stuck between a desire for culture and no money on the one hand and no money to pay for it on the other, charging for the national museums, National Gallery, V&A and so on, had already become a political football. The power of the nationally funded museums to charge for entry was introduced by the Conservative Heath government in 1974, and they were strongly encouraged to do so, though the government fell before this was widely implemented. The subsequent Labour government simply made it clear to the museums that they expected them not to charge. It's worth remembering that the appointments to the boards of these institutions is largely the decision of the Prime Minister. However, in the 80s, the political expectation reversed again, and many of the national museums started to charge, with the National Gallery, the Tate and the British Museum the only notable holdouts against that. Unsurprisingly, visitor numbers in the charging museums fell drastically, and the organisations necessarily became more customer-focused, with greater or lesser success, as this poster from the V&A's Ace Caff with a Nice Museum Attached campaign from Saatchi and Saatchi illustrates. Really controversial in its time, that one. The issue was seemingly settled in 2001, but there are still recent calls from many of the national museums, at least to be able to charge overseas tourists for entry, because of course the funding was a nice thing to have, even if their numbers had gone down. And they were recompensed at the time for the loss of that income in various ways, but of course inflation and time has changed that. Meanwhile, the smaller independent museum sector had to beg, borrow and steal. As Sandy Nairn, former director of the National Portrait Gallery and in the 70s working in small contemporary art galleries, put it to me, those organisations who were in receipt of grant were wildly over-dependent on grant support, We lived and worked very hand to mouth with low-cost solutions. It was a case of searching everywhere and blagging one's way in order to come up with a packed and over-energetic programme. And then there was sponsorship. The Association for Business Sponsorship of the Arts, or ABSA, had been set up as a small charity in 1976, based, as it happens, in Bath. You were looking for a Bath connection. The reason for that is that it was originally based in Imperial Tobacco's offices, and it was felt that being associated too closely with perhaps one sponsor and one that people might regard as controversial wasn't a good idea. But it really came into its own in the 80s. Sponsorship suited the spirit of the age, the politicians believed it could make arts more business-like, I quote, and the corporate sector gained a much greater understanding of how they could achieve soft power benefit through involvement with the arts. I should declare an interest in that I joined ABSA in 1988 as its deputy director, my first paid role in the cultural sector. In those days, the controversy was largely about whether organisations should accept sponsorship at all, since it would be used as an opportunity to cut state funding. Though there were some values-based discussions about the nature of the sponsors' businesses, similar to the current debates about, for example, BP's role as a fossil fuel company. ABSA encouraged mature discussion between sponsors and sponsored, and in 1984 introduced a government-funded matching scheme whereby the sponsor's money received by the arts organisation was doubled if it was a first-time sponsor. This both promoted arts sponsorship to a wider section of the corporate community and financially incentivised arts organisations to get involved. ABSA's annual reports for the period listed hundreds of sponsorships, from major banks to a roof tile company in Northern Ireland. However, by the end of the 80s, some of the opponents' fears had been realised. As Colin Tweedy, then director of ABSA, in its 1989 report wrote, "Inflation has eroded the financial base of many arts companies. Sponsorship used to be seen as the icing on the cake. Now it's the flour, butter, and raisins." This perhaps left philanthropy to make up the gap. Many of the major trusts and foundations were set up and chaired by individuals who were deeply committed to the cultural life of the country. Isaac and Leonard Wolfson, John and David Sainsbury, Jacob Rothschild and Galen Weston in their eponymous charities, and Vivian Duffield at the Claw Foundation. For the national organisations, therefore, major capital investment could and did happen. The Sainsbury wing of the National Gallery and the Claw Galleries at Tate Britain are perhaps the best known of two massive cultural capital projects, almost entirely privately funded in the 1980s. For the regions and/or those without rich friends, it was much harder. The Arts Council report The Glory of the Garden recognised the lack of regional reach of public funding for the arts, and the same subject was not really tackled in the museum sector until the year 2000, with the report and associated funding for what was called Renaissance in the Regions. So despite the influx of private money, heritage was not overall in a good way. I'll read this quote in full. "Towards the end of the 20th century, the UK's heritage assets were in a parlous state. Many of the great Victorian museums and galleries had failed to keep up with both an evolving society and significant maintenance challenges. Revolutions in industry and the economic fortunes of people and places had left valuable architectural heritage empty and decaying. Mines, mills, and canals had been left to rot. Important collections of trains, ships, planes, and papers had expanded beyond their storage capacity or been poorly looked after for lack of funds." I'll give two firmer examples as quoted in the above report, as described by their CEOs. In Sheffield, Weston Park Museum was in a terrible state. Every time it rained, we had to put 40 or 50 buckets out to catch the rain. In a storm, we could end up with 2 inches of water in the exhibition gallery. And then at Duxford, we'd actually managed to build one hangar, but had been unable to raise the money to heat it or install air conditioning. Even so, much of the aircraft and vehicle collection was still based outdoors, where it was constantly deteriorating. So you get the picture. Then, in the early 1990s, Thatcher falls, John Major becomes Prime Minister and has in mind the big idea of a national lottery to support arts and sport. The most successful innovation of any government for years, as he wrote in his autobiography. He trails the idea in Parliament in a white paper, bizarrely 1 month before the 1992 election. His slightly unexpected win in that year gives him free rein to press ahead, and the lottery bill was introduced in December 1992 and received royal assent in October 1993. The first lottery draw was on 19th November 1994. State papers have recently revealed that there was anxiety in Downing Street that the Prime Minister, having bought a ticket for the cameras, might win. There was a hastily released statement which said that if he did, it would all go to charity. Reading the Hansard debates is very interesting. The then Labour opposition was conflicted by, on the one hand, recognising that money for these good causes was badly needed, while on the other being fearful of the consequences of a lottery and, of course, wanting to bash the government. As Mark Fisher, then Shadow Minister for the Arts, put it, the money is needed for the good causes because of government neglect. Historic buildings are falling down, theatres are not being built or in a bad state of repair, and libraries, cinemas and sports grounds are not available in many cities because for 15 years the government has done nothing about these issues. That good causes are needed to shore up the government because particularly in culture, sport and recreation, the government have not done their job. The National Lottery is band-aid for their poor policies. Further opposition came from both sides of the House for an eclectic range of issues. The risk to the pools industry and its own philanthropic spend, based as it was in an area of major deprivation, Liverpool. There were moral objections from the church, and some, mostly conservatives, were opposed to the idea of state-sponsored gambling in the form of a lottery of any kind. In a retrospective article in the New Statesman in 1999, John Major dismisses these objections and is remarkably unsympathetic to politicians or others who expressed a fear that lottery sales would be greatest among people most in need of hope. That is, that the poor would spend too much on lottery tickets against extremely low chances of winning. He describes this as paternalist nonsense, which made me all the keener to set up the lottery. He goes on to say, the other reason I was an enthusiastic supporter of the lottery was more prosaic. I knew it was the only way we could fund a rebirth of cultural and sporting life in Britain. Government has always passed scraps to the arts at the end of the spending round, but never more than scraps. The Treasury's thinking on the matter was drummed into me when I was Chief Secretary and later Chancellor. The competing demands of health, education, pensions and defence would always come first. I knew there was no chance of funding the long-term development of sport or the arts from general government revenue. A lottery could do just that. So at last, we get to the lottery. It should be said that it was a wild success from the start. The brilliant catchphrase of "it could be you," coupled with national primetime coverage of the draw on TV in the early years, captured the public imagination far ahead of the expected financial projections. And this is a reminder how the money is split up. Just under 50% goes to the good causes, over 50% is prize money, and then admin and the operator profit is a mere 5% collectively. The original 1993 Act of Parliament decided the allocations for good causes and stated that a proportion should be allocated for expenditure on or connected with the national heritage. It doesn't define the national heritage, hence the earlier point. That 20% figure for heritage has stayed throughout the last 30 years, except where there was a brief top slicing of 2% all round to pay for the Olympics in 2012. The distributor was the National Heritage Memorial Fund, which in turn set up the Heritage Lottery Fund as its operator because the sums of money involved were actually far bigger than NHMF had been used to, and so they recognised they needed a sort of subsidiary body to do the work. So what has this actually meant in financial terms for the sector? So over the 30 years in total, 50 billion has been raised for good causes, around 700,000 awards, which apparently have fallen in every postcode district in the UK, according to the lottery operator. 9.2 billion to heritage, of which, interestingly, only 2.4 billion has gone to museums, libraries, and archives, which highlights how much of the Heritage Fund does also go to community projects, landscape work, and things that, and of course churches and cathedrals that fall outside those museum library definitions. And 52,000 heritage projects. In the words of one commentator, HLF major grants have contributed to the complete and fundamental change to arts organisations in the UK. The era of HLF grants more generally has helped make Britain the world leader in cultural regeneration. This marks a complete change from the years preceding the HLF, such as the 80s, when it was clear that the UK required huge investment, but nothing was being done. So, of course, in the very earliest grants, many extremely large awards were made aimed at catching up on the backlog. So we'll have a look at some of those transformations. First two projects for which I had some involvement. The Royal Albert Hall was the second ever major grant by HLF and was awarded just over £20 million, along with 20 million from the Arts Council. It's the largest concert hall in Europe, yet it receives no revenue funding from central or local government, relying on a unique organisational setup, with money originally raised from subscribers, a membership that still puts in some money, and profits on the shows that it puts on. But that collectively didn't add up to enough to what was needed. By the 1990s, the hall had become very run down and required significant investment to be competitive in the commercial marketplace in which it was operating. My job as the senior consultant on the bid for that lottery money was to make the case for the hall to be assisted in undertaking a transformational 10-year capital programme. And it was extremely transformational. I apologise to online people who won't be able to see the dot, but the south porch that you see in this picture didn't exist before this project. It was built to match the three other porches, and there was just a little sort of stump of a porch there. But more importantly, there's a very, very large hole under the Royal Albert Hall that wasn't there before, that is the get in and get out dock for crews bringing shows into the hall. Of course, we put in the bid the line of now we know how many holes it takes to fill the Albert Hall, which was one very, very big one. And amazingly, in a 10-year capital programme, they closed for 6 weeks. Unbelievable, because they had to keep the commercial operation going, and that was to reseat the balcony. They had to close then. But they dug a very, very big hole underneath the building. It makes one slightly nervous, without actually having to close. So the second picture there is what is now called Manchester Monastery, Gorton Monastery. This stunning Pugin building had ceased to be a monastery in 1980 and had become very run down and vandalised. An amazing, dynamic woman from the local community decided something had to be done, and various schemes were put forward. At that time, I was asked to advise the lottery board in the Northwest on how to help the applicant put forward a case that was supportable by the fund. The fund really wanted to fund this, so they really wanted to get an application that was fundable. We got there in the end, and the vibrant events and community location is now very actively contributing to the regeneration of an historic community which had become almost a wasteland at the time. As well as these type of huge transformations, there are always a complete range of projects involving both man-made and natural heritage. So before we get to Bath, I'm going to run through some of the other national projects just for flavour. This is in time order, so we're starting in 1995 here. Clevedon Pier, £2,195,313, and you have to account to it down to the £13. One of the earliest grants awarded was for Cleveland, final stages of the restoration of Clevedon Pier. And the wonderful thing is, after it allowed the reinstatement of the decking and the buildings at the end, and repairs to the concrete landing stage, which I think the Waverley still uses. And after the work was done, it was awarded Grade 1 listed status, and it's the only intact pier to be Grade 1 listed. Dyffryn Gardens had been run by Vale of Glamorgan Council for 74 years, along with Dyffryn House, which is just outside Cardiff. So this was romping through. This was just over 6 million for the restoration of the Edwardian gardens and landscapes. And after the work was done, the National Trust took on the management of Dyffryn on a 50-year lease. So it's entered into a new life, but also part of the project, as is shown in this picture, was getting local people involved in that redevelopment and in the gardening and in the outdoors, because it backs on to a very, very urban bit of Cardiff. So if you want to spend £8.3 million, you can save Whistlejacket for the Nation. Recognised as the most ambitious painting produced by Stubbs, I have to say, having recently been to the Royal Collections exhibition of Renaissance drawings, which is brilliant, go and see it before it closes, I just wonder if Stubbs had somehow had access to the Leonardo horse drawings, because this is so different from any other Stubbs and is so wonderful. I'm not a horse person at all, but it is such a wonderful painting. And the National Gallery took it on tour after it had acquired it, and then since it's been on continuous display, it's been credited with increasing visitor numbers quite specifically for that painting. I have to say, when I'm in London, I call in and say hi, as it were. I do think it's fantastic. Completely different change of flavour now, out on the moors. This was a large-scale partnership project which both improved biodiversity of the moors by reinstating peatlands and heathlands, and it restored footpaths, which meant that people then stayed on the footpaths rather than then wandering through other bits of the landscape which disturbed the vegetation. It also had a big focus, this one. It was 3+ million on citizen science research. And so they've now got really long-term citizen science on breeding birds. And you know when you see in the paper something that says climate change means these birds are breeding 3 weeks earlier? This project is delivering data for that sort of answer. Lincoln Castle, now this is a fun one, at £12,227,640. This was the major grant part of a £22 million scheme of 5 years. My former colleague Simon Butler, who worked on the Beckford Tower project, was the project manager on this, and it's a good illustration of things that happen in capital projects. The lift shaft here, they were merrily digging the hole to put the lift shaft in, and when they got to near the bottom of the hole, they discovered an Anglo-Saxon burial with intact skeleton. So, as you can imagine, complete shutdown of site, all the rest, but it got there in the end, and it's a great visit, Lincoln Castle, if you haven't been there. Different one, Pontypridd Lido. We have our own Lido in Bath, slightly older than 1927, of course, but this 2.375 million project restored the Lido, which had closed in 1991. Interestingly, it had been built by the Miners' Welfare Fund originally, but had faded away and declined. And it saved this, it's grade 2, and it saved it and is now modernised and used by the public. Here's another of my have to go if you've never been there one, the Peace Hall in Halifax. The grant here was £7 million. This is an amazing building. I love this building. And it used to be used for the textile mill owners to show off their wares, show little bits of their pieces of their wares in the marketplace. It's now used, it's got shops, it's got cafes, it's got incredibly vibrant exhibition events program. And it is, as you can see, it's just bizarre. It's such a wonderful building, extraordinary. Again, change of scale, change of style. The Scarpa Flow Museum in Hoy in the Orkney Archipelago. I mean, it's really 2 sheds, this museum, but it's 2 sheds filled with the most fantastic artifacts, including, as you can see there, artifacts from the German fleet, which was deliberately scuttled in Scarpa Flow in 1919. and some terribly poignant stories about the loss of a British Navy ship from a U-boat in the Second World War as well. And being able to display all this really well and build a cafe and build an education room has been transformational for that little museum. In fact, they were shortlisted for Museum of the Year the other year, which for a little museum that you have to get to Orkney, then get on a ferry, then make sure the wind's not blowing too strongly in the wrong direction, is really fantastic. So here's something a bit different. This is the only one that's below 100,000 actually on this list. 88,300 this was, which set out to capture social history by exploring the relationship between fans of Black Sabbath and the influence of the industrial landscape of Birmingham, the Black Country. And captured all sorts of stories and fan portraits. And there's now actually, well, one of the restored canal bridges is named after Black Sabbath as well. So, bit different. They're all different, they're all extraordinary. This is the Loughborough Bell Foundry, which was saved by a £4 million grant. I'm only sorry that the fund was unable to save the Whitechapel Bell Foundry, but there we go. And apprentices were recruited, which would have been hard to find before there was funding to do it, and the site museum was redeveloped, including its archive. So there's plenty to carry on learning about this important and very old craft. Now this one is just amazing. This is the coast of North Wales, where £1 million is being spent on planting 5 million seagrass seedlings. Oh, yes. I know why this is. It's because some of these slides were in a show once and I didn't pick it up. Sorry about that. And so 18 football pitches worth of seagrass is being planted for water quality, spawning grounds and carbon capture. They're being planted like that, so it's an amazing job. Then one that's very close to my heart here, Divis Mountain in Belfast, which is a National Trust project that received lottery funding. Divis is, of course, the largest green space on Belfast's doorstep. But the trouble is that historically it was only accessible by one part of Belfast's community. A piece of land came up which the National Trust was able to acquire with the help of this grant of £3 million. But more importantly, it's now going to be accessible from the whole of Belfast. It's more complicated than that, but both Catholic and Protestant poor communities on the edge of the city. And visitor, cafe, education spaces and so on. Fantastic project. Crystal Palace Park went into the Paleolithic now, very suitable for here, of course. The dinosaurs down here, the concrete dinosaurs of Crystal Palace Park, give us a historic insight into paleontology in 1850s, because some of them are more or less right and some of them are really rather wrong, but they're very jolly and they were falling apart. And so this grant of £5 million is restoring all sorts of aspects of the park, particularly the dinosaurs and Paxton's Great Walk in Crystal Palace. And then I'm going to end on this Derbyshire one of Next Door Nature, where it's teaching young people in urban settings how to understand, appreciate and grow nature on their doorstep. So a range and variety of all sorts of things across the country, from Black Sabbath to dinosaurs in Crystal Palace to the lot. And so we get to Bath. So what's been happening in Bath? The headline stats in Bath are that between 1995 and 2024, £54,948,235 has gone to heritage in the city. And that's with 193 grants across the city. This shows how the money's come in over time, mostly dribbling in at relatively low levels with occasional gloriously large spikes. But I'm putting that a different way here, just to make that clearer. This is the whole pie is all the money that's come in, but 82% of that money has gone to 5 organisations. And you can see them here: Bath Abbey, Baines Council, Bath Preservation Trust with its museums, Cleveland Pools and the Holborn. Between them, and then there's 130 other applications, which is everyone else. I should, in fairness to Bath and North East Somerset and to Bath Preservation Trust, point out that they're more than one organisation, each of those. BPT has its 4 museums. Bath and North East Somerset does everything from the heritage services to the parks to the landscape and other green spaces. So they are, and you can see the numbers in here are the number of grants that were applied for. BPT, I'm pleased to say, tops the list on the numbers of grants applied for, from little things to bigger things. And as you can see, the percentage of money is scooped up by a small number of organisations, as is ever the case. You know, there was the Albert Hall with 40 million, British Museum, God knows how much the Great Court cost, I can't remember. So we can look at that in a different way, which is these are the largest projects distributed, successful projects in Bath. So the Bath Abbey footprint project, the largest, you can see Cleveland Pools, Holborn, Archway, Beckford's Tower, Sydney Gardens, the one North East Somerset representative, Folly Farm Nature Reserve, which is a Avon Wildlife Trust project just southeast of Chew Valley. Bathscape, number 1 Royal Crescent, Royal Victoria Park, and there's all the other 130s getting ever diminishingly, unbelievably small actually, some of them. There's one which I'm sure is an anomaly at £38, but must have been someone who just slightly overspent their grant. And Victoria Park really early, one thing that interested me in doing this was how much cheaper number 1 Royal Crescent was, essentially a bigger project than Beckford's Tower, but there we go. But we did have one single major donor with number 1 Royal Crescent as well. So let's have a look at some of those in more detail. We all know about the Abbey Footprint Project. What a fantastic project. I think it comes into the category yet again of transformational for the Abbey in a number of ways. Obviously transformational for education and interpretation of the building in the underground museum displays and the song school for the choir, and the fantastic transformation of the nave with the completely relaid ledger stones and the underground heating. And of course, associated with these great capital works was consistently an education program, really good education program, an outreach program, and recording all those ledger stones with considerably more grace and courtesy to those lying underneath them than Gilbert Scott had done when he did the alterations to the floor in the 19th century. My favourite bit, of course, is the heating of the Abbey through the Roman. I mean, it's mind-boggling that we're heating a, whatever it is, early medieval abbey through the Roman drain by 21st century technology. So the heat exchangers on the left in the actual Roman drain and the heat pumps on the right. My second most favourite thing about the Abbey project, my first favourite was that under the floor here in the education area, when they were doing the archaeology, they did find an apse of an Anglo-Saxon building, so they probably found the original cathedral. So just brilliant. Unfortunately, that did have to be covered up again, but at least they found it. So that's the Abbey, great project. Holborn extension. Could 4.999 million be trying to tuck under 5 million? I think it probably could. But they then did manage to go back for an extra $1 million for endowing the Holborn as well, which is pretty canny. I mean, although endowments are allowed by the lottery, second Lottery Act allowed for endowments, but they're pretty rare because politicians don't like tying up lots of capital in endowments. I think that's a really nice picture of the Holborn building, and it entirely demonstrates why, although it was extremely controversial at the time, it sits as an art object in the green setting and reflects the trees around it. I can go at great length into the Holborn controversy if anyone wants to, but you probably all remember it. Cleveland Pools, of course, I don't know what the most up-to-date position is with Cleveland Pools, but I do know that it doesn't look like that at the moment after the damage from the floods. Really terrible situation, and I'm pleased to say that the lottery is working with Cleveland Pools to try and resolve the situation of who's to blame, and other than rising rivers, who's to blame, and when that will come back into use. But let's hope it comes back soon, because it is a remarkable achievement of a project. The Archway Centre, nearly 4 million. For those who don't know, but it's perhaps less visible than other projects. This is the redevelopment of the laundry building opposite the Roman baths and connected underground. That's the Roman bath itself. And then there's this underground connection to what is then an education suite for children coming for education courses to visit the Roman baths. And all that pavement is Roman, so they get the chance to look at real Roman stuff that other people don't have access to as well. If any of you had children in Bath that went to the old education facilities, you will be well aware how inadequate they were given the importance of the visit and the place. And so this is a fantastic new addition to the offer at the Roman baths. Yes, here are some kids doing some archaeology underground. And here they are in some of the spaces that have been found for them. Beckford's Tower, if any of you have not visited the marvellously new open Beckford's Tower, please do. It was solving a difficult problem at the top of the tower, which was water ingress coming merrily in whenever it rained too hard from a westerly direction, which is, of course, most of the time that it rains. Also discovering and rediscovering and uncovering and making accessible the grotto tunnel that was Beckford's entrance to the upper part of his garden around the tower, and completely reimagining and representing both the museum itself and the content of how it presented it, and also finding this found space on a flat roof to give views across the landscape and get a sense of, not just from the top of the tower, but a much more expansive view halfway up. And again, the investment by the lottery in community programs and activity programs really did change the audience of the tower and brought in a whole lot of new people to it. Sydney Gardens, again, possibly a much slightly more invisible one, because Sydney Gardens was there beforehand and is there now, but a lot of restoration work, fantastic new children's playground, and generally putting back the kind of investment needed to keep it alive as a pleasure garden, the only of the great 18th century pleasure gardens that's still really around, much in its current form, much in its early form, other than the fact that the little aberrations of a canal and a railway going through it, but otherwise pretty much in its original form. There they are, there's the playground. Bathscape, this is one of those ones that comes under the aegis of Bath and North East Somerset, but was actually a genuine partnership project. There were 12 partners in the organisation, including BPT, the National Trust, the 2 universities, Wessex Water, a number of others, the Wildlife Trust, the Cotswold Board as well. And this was, the priority around here was a reminder of the fact that Bath's city social life in its historic period was intimately bound up with the landscape, but also should be today. And so we were looking at why some of the communities on the edge of Bath nevertheless didn't use the landscape that was right on their doorstep, and a whole load of activities took place. Perhaps the most visible thing, a reminder of it that is left now, is the fact that the Circuit of Bath Walk is now established as a waymarked circuit of 26 miles. So anyone who wants to walk around Bath for 26 miles now has a proper waymarked route to do so, not just when Julian House is fundraising for it. Number 1 Royal Crescent, that was the reunification of Number 1 with its servants' wing, Number 1A. This photograph was taken on one of the very, very few glorious days when we were able to get rid of all cars in the Crescent, and wouldn't it be nice if it could come back again? And again, we were very fortunate, as I said earlier, in having significant matching funding from Andrew Brownsword as the donor of number 1A to the project, as well as other philanthropists in Bath. But the lottery grant has made it possible. And I'll just dwell on it for a moment, because when I arrived at BPT, BPT had acquired number 1A, but didn't quite know how it was going to do what it was going to do, and thought that, oh, well, we'll just put some historic rooms in there. And I have to say that I quite deliberately, quite apart from where the money is, took us down the lottery route to make sure we did it properly. Because there is, I think it goes back to that comment by Sandy Nairn about low-cost solutions. And if you don't have much money, you always head towards low-cost, not quite good enough solutions. And what the lottery has offered people is the chance to do things properly. So I hope we did number 1 properly. And then finally, a very early project, a big project of works across Victoria Park, the restoration of the Medici lions, I discovered they're called, the copies of the Medici lions at least, but also quite a lot of other work in the park, including the restoration of the Royal Crescent ha-ha, amongst other things. So that's the 9 projects that nicked all the money. But there are another 182, and I promise I'm not now going to go through 182 other projects, but I picked a couple of examples of smaller grants to represent all the rest, just for a bit of flavour. So this is an under £10,000 grant that went to Bath City Farm, and this is where they got young people, quite often kids who'd been excluded from school, building this playground with a dinosaur skeleton in it, and really spending time outdoors doing stuff, which is what Bath City Farm is so very good at. So it's a small grant with a big impact on a number of kids who don't otherwise get a lot quite often. And then, complete contrast, Widcombe Rising, 2010. There was I think it was an anniversary of the canal coming through Widcombe, probably the 200th anniversary of the canal coming through Widcombe. And so it was a watery theme that the lottery supported, and there was lots of watery heritage, but also lots of good time attached to that grant. And then, hot off the press, I believe midday today, Fairfield House has received a grant today, which will help it build its resilience to continue to serve a role with its historic background as being the temporary home of Emperor Haile Selassie, bringing together a community not often seen in Bath. And so that's an excellent smaller scale grant that will allow Fairfield House to carry on building this excellent work that it's doing, under the chairmanship of William Heath, who's here in the room, so he can tell you more about it if you want to be told. Probably will tell you even if you don't want to be told, actually, knowing William. And then, first grant awarded in Bath. Any guesses? It's the Abbey. It's the Abbey again, £500,000 for internal decoration in the Abbey. So they did well. They got off the blocks really fast for a decent sum of money, actually. It was very hard getting any photographic images of this, but it's amazing how pre-internet documentation falls away, unless you've got it in your cupboards at home, as I have some. So I think that sort of demonstrated that some marvellous things have happened, both locally and nationally, through the National Lottery Heritage Fund in Bath. But I did think it was worth thinking about the what-ifs. This is a quotation from Dickens, Nicholas Nickleby, about the fever of gambling, in this instance at the races. Who thought of money, ruin, or the morrow in the savage intoxication of the moment? Well, I think the lottery's had some good savage intoxication moments, but I thought we should ask the counterfactual of what if it hadn't come along or had not prioritised heritage as one of its good causes? And or where would we be if there were in future no lottery money for heritage? Should we be thinking about money, ruin, or the morrow? On the first question, I'm reminded of Aslan in the Narnia books, who said that no one is ever told what would have happened. But we've already established that the heritage was in a parlous state. Successive governments over 25 or more years had overseen a real terms decline in funding gleaned from the scraps from the Treasury's table, and the attempts to fill this by either philanthropy or sponsorship had only been partially successful, and only mostly for the leading national organisations. It's hard to imagine a circumstance where governments would have prioritised levying more direct taxation for heritage, even though the amounts in question are small compared to the overall public purse. By way of illustration, the NHS spends in 1 year more than 3 times the amount that the lottery has raised in 30 years of all the good causes put together. So one can imagine a scenario where the spiral of decline had accelerated faster. Institutions would have closed. Government might have had to legislate to allow collections to be partially sold off in order to create the funds necessary to mend the roof. Crucially, and for me this was the killer when I thought about it, fewer people by now would even care, because 30 years' investment in education, access and inclusion could not have taken place. It's not a good thing to consider. Of course, I don't and cannot know what would have happened, and it might be that an enlightened government would have been elected and would have said it was worth raising income tax by, say, 0.6%. On this year's figures, that would raise the same as the lottery does for good causes each year, with no other taxes changed, 0.6% of income tax. The rather less hypothetical question is what would happen if Lottery for Heritage reduced or got taken away? I can think of at least 3 ways in which this might happen, and I'll look at each of these in turn. First of all, a slide in sales. The good causes take in 23-4 was 0.2 billion lower than that in the previous year. So there may be some decline already. If you look at statistics for lotteries globally, the market is expected to grow, but this is for 2 main reasons: new global markets like the Middle East and Africa, and new products. I'm illustrating with the point with the house prize draw company O'Mays, who are currently running a draw for a beautiful house in Bath Easton. Prizes of tangible rewards like this are growing fast, and they fall outside of gambling legislation. The O'Mays, which means their taxation position is different. The O'Mays example also appeals to people's charitable instincts in that each monthly draw supports a high-profile charity, such as the RNLI, or in this case, the British Heart Foundation. It's fair to assume, though I don't actually have any data, that products like these compete with the gambling pound in your pocket, if you have such a thing. Of course, there are other reasons for a slide in sales also, not least the significant impact of the cost of living crisis, and maybe a better understanding of the poor likelihood of actually winning the jackpot of the National Lottery. Secondly, priorities for the National Lottery could change. It only takes secondary legislation for the percentage shares to be changed by the Secretary of State, as happened when the top slice was done for the Olympics. Primary legislation was needed to abolish the Millennium Commission, who most visibly funded the Dome, but also other major capital projects, including the Wales Millennium Stadium, the Principality Stadium, the Great Court at the BM, and Tate Modern. But there have been, throughout the lottery's life, also calls from the public, as you see here, for it to be spent on other priorities, usually the NHS. That said, the Lottery Good Cause annual take represents about 1% of the NHS's budget. Finally, government might decide that there were other overriding national reasons to take control of the money people are prepared to spend on lotteries. The original English state lottery, after all, was put forward by Queen Elizabeth I in 1567 to help pay for the Navy. One can imagine all too easily a circumstance where the lottery was used as a way of engaging public investment in an area of imperative national concern, even if war bonds were the way they did it last time. So what would the sector do if there were such a decline? The Heritage Fund has well-oiled processes for dealing with year-on-year fluctuations in lottery take, but an ongoing decline might bring back some of the spectres of infrastructure decay. 30 years is a long time in the life of a building or the relevance of a display, and so some of the original lottery-funded infrastructure may now be needing further significant investment. In fact, I spotted that an early grant, not the earliest, was in fact to Beckford Tower in the mid-1990s. not, I hasten to add, to solve all the problems that the second lot did, but it was nevertheless to do what was thought then to be the major restoration. So some of these may be needing further investment. I have heard a senior figure say, unattributably, I should add, that the fund has spent billions on access and inclusion and spent it well, and quite right too. Nevertheless, those billions by definition haven't been spent on mending the roof. I've also heard more than one canal trust, hence the picture, make the point that if you mend all the locks in one go, it's likely they'll all come to the end of their functional life in one go. There are 105 locks on the Kennet and Avon Canal, repaired with one of the earliest lottery grants of 25 million. In technical terms, the lottery is still additional to, rather than a substitution for, public expenditure from the other grant-making bodies, the Arts Council and so on. But the Arts Council, as one of the lottery distributors, blurred those lines some time ago by using lottery funding to invest in what are essentially revenue programmes. And COVID was the great example where the project programmes were completely suspended and lottery money was diverted, and absolutely necessary it was too, to keep cultural organisations afloat. Other sources have declined over the life of the lottery too. The English Heritage Historic England pot of grant funding was 40 million in 2003. It's now 10 million. You'll remember those philanthropic family trusts. The leadership is passing to a new generation, and there's some evidence that their interests are more towards, for instance, environmental issues than the built heritage or the fine arts. So I'd question whether the funding is truly additional anymore to anyone but the Treasury's definition. There are certainly some organisations who are extremely adept at moving from lottery project to lottery project, and using that to underpin their core activity. These are the organisations which could be in some difficulty if the tap turned off. But one must hope for the best as well as speculate for the worst. All this to me spells out why we should be vocal in our desire for the lottery to carry on and for Heritage to continue to be a major recipient. I'm pleased to say that there's no actual indication of radical change at this point. The fund released its new 10-year strategy, Heritage 2033, very imaginative name, a year ago, and is now spending to its new tweaked objectives in pursuit of this strategy. And this is its vision for that strategy. Our vision is for heritage to be valued, cared for and sustained for everyone now and in the future. We're dedicated to supporting projects that connect people and communities to heritage. I'll end by saying that it's up to Bath, you in this room and others, to work out how to help the fund spend its money and achieve its vision. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Caroline. I'm sure there are plenty of people in the room who would like to help you spend yet more money.
Not me. Actually, the awful thing about being on one of the lottery committees is that you're actually making decisions on what not to spend money on, because all the projects that come up to committee level are fundable. And it's the job of the poor outsiders who get drawn together to decide and prioritise between the too many projects for the money available. That's less so in other parts of the country, but certainly in London South it is always competitive.
I'm sure it is.
Yeah.
I'm led to understand that the decision making is on a project by project basis, not on the grounds of geographical allocation. Is that?
It's a bit like planning applications. They can only look at what comes before them. We do look at the overall geographical spread, in our case, within the patch. And I would say that it's not that decisions are made on geographical location, but should a very good project come forward where there is a big blank hole in the map, we might look at it with slightly more favourable eyes to fill that gap. And I'm sure that what is behind your question is, with all these millions of trillions that already have come to Bath, where does that leave any other big new project that comes forward? And I think it would be considered fairly and on the strength of the project against the field that it is up against at that very meeting. I mean, that's the difficulty. The officers do a really good job of trying to manage the pipeline so you don't have too many infelicitous clashes coming before the committee, but we don't fund everything.
Well, anyway, for me, it's been a fascinating evening. I have seen lottery projects in different parts of Bath going through different stages and been involved in some of the accounting for some of them as well, which is a tough task. But thank you very much for enlightening us. I'd now like to ask if anybody in the room has any questions, and if there is anybody online who would like to put a question in the chat, we'll try and get to those too.
Hi, thank you. Yeah, Caroline, it's William. Yeah, thank you for name-checking our project. So I can see that the lottery works really well, pragmatically, in a sort of national British context. I can see also that for lots of projects, and we're one, building international links is really important, and there's fantastic heritage abroad, which is massively underfunded. Do you ever work with international counterparts? Are you aware of any sort of network able to fund international links?
Short answer is no. It used to be Europe, of course, when we were part of it. An awful lot of, I didn't really go into that, but an awful lot of big projects, and indeed relatively small projects, did get money from the European Social Fund or the European Regional Development Fund in the past, or the structural funds of the EU, but that's a closed door nowadays. It's not really answering your question directly, but the National Trust is part of and hosts an international organisation of national trusts. And unsurprisingly, most of the international national trusts are nothing like the National Trust in terms of its structure and its funding profile. But they make the INTO, as it's called, the International National Trusts Organisation, has its offices in London, and might be a very good route of finding out such links if you wanted to try them.
Any other questions in the room? We have a question online.
Actually, it's not online, it's from me. Caroline, if you look at the Royal Crescent, it's got, the road is fabulous sets, the pavements, the old pennant pavement. Was that paid for? I mean, who paid for that? Was that the Heritage Fund, or was it something else? I'm trying to remember.
The paving was largely funded by the residents of the Royal Crescent, actually. The sets were, I don't think that was part of the Victoria Park one. And the reinstatement of the pavement and railings was a fundraiser within the Royal Crescent. And it may have been matched by a bit of that Park's money, but not, and a bit of Bain's money, because obviously it is actually Bath's highway, it's not a private road. But to get it done, to get it over the line, it was supported by the residents of the Royal Crescent.
We have, yes, one here. Rob Campbell.
Hi, Caroline. Rob Campbell, we had a chat earlier about Bath and North East Somerset Council, so thank you for all that money. I was just wondering, when you invest in Bath, there seems to be a disproportionate impact, like positive impact, because we've got that impact for local people, and there are some fantastic local projects up there, but that amazing international audience that come through as well. And that probably sits behind some of those investment decisions. But I was wondering, from your point of view, it might be a tricky question, but you might have been asked before. What's your, what was the favourite project that you've given the green light to?
I thought you might
and
ask
also, might be slightly different answer, which one do you think has had the most impact and the biggest legacy?
Gosh. Well, I haven't, I've only been on the committee 3 or 4 years, so in terms of projects that I've had a role in deciding on for the lottery, actually it's a very recent one, which I thought was outstanding, which is a project in Bristol, which was announced the other day by a charity that helps young homeless people in Bristol and helps them transition into adult life and work and all these sorts of things. They happen to be in a 17th century merchant's building, and which is falling apart because it's been run by charities for years and years and years. And they grasped the fact of heritage funding and an activity plan to go with being in an old building with both hands and then some, in terms of the way they weren't just saying, we're in an old building, so the Heritage Fund will pay for it. They took the opportunity of engaging the young people with whom they work in projects, in doing oral histories, doing all sorts of things, and they were completely inspirational when I went on my visit there. So I'd rank that one very highly indeed. In terms of earlier project and impact, in Bath, I think probably the impact is the impact you don't see. It's the ongoing education projects that probably didn't happen beforehand that now happen. I mean, talking about our international visitors, as I said about the Roman baths, you know, for the importance of the Roman baths, the previous education provision, I hate to say it, was inadequate for the standard of the offer and underinvested in. So to have that done properly and well in good spaces in a really fun and engaging way for kids, it's great. But I always have, and this is not a best project or most impact, of course I love the Royal Albert Hall. Who doesn't love the Royal Albert Hall? It's big, round and fat and red, you know. So because that was a very big, very early project, and I was quite a baby consultant in some ways, though the hall didn't know that at the time, I found that very exciting. But what was I going to say now? Oh yeah, projects. There is a downside to project funding, of course, which is there is a risk that it comes along and then it goes away again. And it seems to me that the best projects are those who take the opportunity of something starting with a lottery project and then have really, really worked out to embed that benefit downstream for the organisation. And I now have written through me like a stick of rock a comment made by Alzheimer's Kensington and Chelsea about a project at Chelsea Hospital. And they said, we would, for our clients, i.e. older people with dementia, we would rather a project never happened than it came and then went away. And I think that puts an enormous responsibility on people running projects and running new education programs because they got the lottery money, not to give it and then take it away.
Fiona Gawley, Bath and North East Somerset Council as well. I think that... Oh, sorry, is that better? I think this follows on from your previous comment. How important is it to have a geographical spread as well as a longevity in order to have an impact for a project? Or is it better to have it a focus in a smaller area, sort of broader or deeper, is the question? This is my own top of the head, as I'm not answering for anyone in saying this. I mean, in legislative terms, the lottery is there, A, for public benefit, and B, for the benefit of lottery players. And so if you think there is a demographic range of lottery players, or a disproportionate demographic range of lottery players, and I'm sure data exists on who plays the lottery and who plays the lottery to what extent, then one of the things you need to be looking at is, am I actually serving in Bath? Are these lottery projects actually helping the people who bought most of the tickets in Bath? And I think that's a useful, salutary reminder to have at the back of your mind. In terms of, so legislatively, the lottery is absolutely not there to benefit international tourists. But us having a rich, internationally renowned cultural heritage is of benefit to Britain. So, you know, you can argue it round, and go and do there likewise is also a useful message to be able to be conveying about how you do heritage education or whatever else. In terms of national reach, I think it's quite difficult. The funding decision would not be taken on where your visitors come from. The funding decision will be taken on the location of the organisation and what it plans to do and what the benefit of what it's doing is. So I don't think you could, I mean, obviously if something, I can think of an example that might be coming forward in Bath, but something that has a national importance as a collection, of course, needs to be stated as such, but it'll be treated out of London and South money, not national money, unless you had a partnership with
the Bose Museum, or wherever else might have a load of costumes, for instance, in Northumberland. So I think focus on what you're doing as an organisation and how much benefit you can give to people within your reach.
Caroline, first of all, just to say how lucky we've been in Bath to have had you, 14 years at Bath Preservation Trust and the rest.
Thank you.
How do we stop the lottery getting stale? Because there's a change in retailing, there's a change in the way people approach the retail offering, there's a change, there's all the competition.
Yeah.
The risk is that it will continue to decline in its appeal.
Well, that's Alwyn's job as the new operator, really. And I suspect one of the reasons for the change in operator was a feeling that that it needed a fresh insight from different competitors as to how it's done. New games have come and gone within the overall envelope of the National Lottery, and no doubt new games will come and go. I think it's now switched to being more played online than people buying tickets in shops on the app. And so there's not that little pink piece of paper transaction that you then lose in the washing machine anymore.
I still remember my very first ones on the very first day.
And Allwyn, as the new operator, I mean, it touches two things I said earlier. One is about the global nature of the lottery markets, in that Alwyn is a Czech billionaire owned by or part of the consortium and involved in lottery operations in other countries around the world. And of course, Allwyn overall might have a business strategy that was just grow elsewhere in the world. So that's the risk I was trying to highlight. However, in their license pitch, they did say that more money was going to come into good causes than Camelot had been able to raise. And they have said that the dip in the last year was about the transfer of operation. And because Camelot tried to fight the transfer legally, they haven't been able to introduce new machines, new ways of operating and all the rest as soon as they would like. So we're still holding out for all this lovely extra money they promised us.
Okay, well, we don't very well in the room. There is a question from an online viewer, so I'll pass it to my colleague.
Yeah, so we have one online from David Carpenter. How has Bath been successful in other good causes? Start again. How has Bath been successful in other good causes areas?
Right, so the other good causes are sport, and then the charity community fund. The short answer is I don't know the answer to that. But sport is an interesting issue, actually, because sport, having done quite a lot of sporting facilities and so on around the place, I don't know about in Bath, but in Bradford-on-Avon we got the rugby club from sports lottery money, and jolly good one it is. And they've now moved away from doing either elite sport, I exaggerate slightly, but either the elite sport to get the medals at the Olympics, or really small community participation projects, less than £20,000. So there's now a big hole, as far as I can see, and I've been trying to work out if I'm wrong, because I can't quite believe it, but I have gone into this several times. So there's a big hole in the middle, which is projects that cost more than £20,000, but are not Jessica Ennis. And I'd have thought there's a comparator with heritage on that as well, in that you don't want it to be just already funded institutions or titchy-witchy community projects. And as you saw from the examples I gave, if you spend £3 million well in an outdoor setting, you can engage an awful lot of people over an awful lot of time. So short answer, I don't know how well Bath has done. I suspect it's done reasonably well on the community fund, because there are a lot of really active charities in Bath that will know that that's the place to go to. And then the Arts Council funding the difficulty is with, well, obviously Holborn got some arts money as well as the heritage money. And there has been lottery money. One of the things that lottery money was spent on was museum partnerships, actually, and BPT had some money from that to work with the other museums in Bath. And that was
a useful, if revenue-type exercise to get some funding for. One of the interesting thing about the Bath Arts, and there's been quite a lot of grants at the smaller, the really small end of the Bath Arts scene as well, the Naturals and various others. The Theatre Royal, of course, is an immensely commercial and lucrative theatre operation. I think it may have had grant funding for the Euston Off, but I'm afraid I can't remember.
Okay, well, if we have no more questions in the room, can I just invite everybody to give Caroline a warm round of applause for a fascinating evening. Thank you, Caroline.